Now, let's talk a little bit more about this. We got Michael Faulkender, who's former Deputy Treasury Secretary and participated in a lot of the stuff with China and the U.S. In the Treasury Department. Most recently, something like a year ago, I was there. So, Michael, one question I have is, why do you think President Trump was so keen on having this summit?
Yeah, I think it's the most critical relationship that there is around the world. Every foreign policy challenge we have ultimately comes back to China. You know, whether it's Iran, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Russia, at the end of the day, China is their benefactor and their primary trading partner. And so you cannot deal with the challenges around the world without coming back to China. And then the other piece is, as Secretary Bessent has said on multiple occasions, they are the most unbalanced economy in the world, and they are creating economic problems everywhere, and we need to get them rebalanced towards something that's more sustainable and address some of these vulnerabilities that we have. And so, as you were just discussing, we have got to fix our domestic supply of critical minerals or move to alternative sources with allies. But in the interim, until we have those replacements in place, we are going to have to continue working with China on that. And that's why I think it was so critical that he took some of these CEOs with him in order to make sure that whatever negotiation they have over magnets and critical minerals, as well as AI, is actually going to work for these companies that are at the forefront of these technologies.
Well, I noticed that Scott talked about setting up something, I think he called it a board of investment or an investment board, which would be certainly not the family jewels. It wouldn't be CFIUS, which is a whole different process for national security. And maybe that will govern some of the broken parts of the Phase 1 deal that China never lived up to. I mean, they're supposed to be buying a lot of commodities, I guess soybeans being one of them, but certainly not the only one. You're right about the critical materials, the rare earths and so forth. I guess there's something going. Boeing's going to sell airplanes in China, I guess. I don't know. Is the H200 NVIDIA chip, has that been signed, sealed, and delivered? Do we know that, Michael?
We don't know that for sure. I know that was part of what was being negotiated. I have not yet seen the readout to see whether or not they came to some kind of deal on that, because I know that the head of NVIDIA was working with President Trump in terms of getting a national security release in order to be able to sell some of those AI chips. Obviously not the most technologically advanced ones. These are a couple of generations old. But certainly that was going to be part of the discussion, given that the head of NVIDIA was part of the group that went. In terms of the investment board, I actually think that linking it with CFIUS is the right way to think about it, because, you know, irrespective of what part of the United States China is investing in, we always have to look at it through a national security lens, and CFIUS is the group to do it. And Secretary Bessent is the chair of the CFIUS committee.
Yes, but I don't want to sell any family jewels. I mean, Robert Lighthizer.
No, not at all.
You know, Bob Lighthizer taught me this long time ago. Family jewels, and you have to be careful about what constitutes family jewels, right? I don't want to certainly sell China anything where they can, you know, either equal us, get ahead of us, reverse engineer. You know how they operate. You got to put your blueprint on the table because they own 51% of the company. I mean, that's standard operating procedure. Was supposed to be solved in the Phase 1 deal in the first term, but you know it was never really solved. They didn't live up to it. I mean, all right. So all that said, tariffs seem not to be on the table, Mike Faulkender. They were a very big subject a year ago. They seem not to be on the table right now. Maybe you could say a word on that. And basically, will the, I don't know, deal or arrangement of last fall, will it be extended another year? So will there be some stability in the tariff and trading part of the relationship?
Yeah, I think that is exactly what's going to happen. And the reason that you didn't hear much discussion about it is because I don't think the president is looking to modify the current tariff arrangement that's in place with China. I instead think that he's worried about dealing with some of these specific industry vulnerabilities. We already mentioned magnets and critical minerals. Pharmaceuticals are going to be part of that. And then also, given that China and the United States are the leads on AI, I would think that negotiations on some of these AI governance issues are critical to what's going on. But I think that those are the primary things to be resolved. I don't see reason why the tariff arrangement that's currently in place is what's imminently needed to be altered.
I think that's one reason, maybe a minor one, but stock markets are roaring right now. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the tariff warfare with China is not one of those reasons. So, Mike Faulkender, thank you, my friend. We appreciate it very, very much.